Now that the dust has settled and we can finally look at the facts, look at the truth of the matter, I'm going to try to run through the reality of the situation in Venezuela that happened yesterday. And then after we know what happened, I'm going to go back and look at the media manipulation and how they twisted this to continue to push their narrative. Now, first of all, about 3 o'clock in the morning at a military airport in Caracas, about 14 armed professionals alongside Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez had apparently manipulated an entire unit of soldiers, around 100-ish, to show up for this makeshift propaganda video. This video had Juan Guaido and Lopez standing in front of these very confused and dazed-looking soldiers as Juan Guaido essentially just launched his first stage of Operation Freedom, which is very cliche, but this is what happened. So, according to the soldiers themselves, they were manipulated by these professionals and their sergeants who were in cooperation with these professionals. And once they found out that Juan Guaido was there, the majority of them left because they understood that it was a coup. But some of them were still held there at gunpoint all the way up until the middle of the day. Now, after it settled, about 20 of these members remained, the vast majority of them being the sergeants and the leaders of these units that stayed, and they intermingled with protesters on the highway intersection just outside of this airport, an area that has been a major target for these opposition groups that have been led by the United States. We have videos and proof of the connections to these radical groups being funded and trained by the United States. They sent out these tweets and messages as hundreds of protesters showed up, and they intermingled with these protesters, handing out weapons and supplies and setting up military defenses with machine guns, 4 MG-34 type machine guns, some kind of variant, with thousands of rounds of ammunition. And as the military and police forces of the government showed up to quell this, they were met with violent responses from these groups, from these professionals, handing out weapons and supplies to the protesters, throwing Molotov cocktails and opening fire at the police, which they injured 8 government officials of the police and armed forces, to where the armed forces themselves were only firing rubber bullets. If you see the thumbnail of this video, that's one of the very few that were actually injured of these armed and deadly and violent protesters that was hit with a rubber bullet in the hand and I believe the face, which did not kill him. It is not fatal, but again, that is going to be a face of some bogus, non-existent revolution. Now, after this was all quelled and the government put a stop to this violent protest, if you can even call it a protest at this point, the protesters scattered, including those professionals, which made their way to embassies and hid and changed their uniforms in order to avoid persecution from the Venezuelan government. Obviously, if you're going to launch a violent coup d'etat, this is what this should be called. It's not a protest, a coup d'etat against a sovereign government. You can expect repercussions for that. So after this happened, Maduro was falsely accused of fleeing the country to Cuba and then being called back by Russia because they said it wasn't a good idea, which no proof exists, and it was refuted by all parties. So first of all, here's the proof that these military personnel that showed up being tricked by their leaders that are likely bought and paid for by the United States government and trained part of this same opposition group. This is the same thing that happened in 2001, where they were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to these military leaders to defect. They weren't grassroots defecting, they were being bought and paid for. So let's listen to the testimony from the ones that were being tricked.
What happened? They tricked us. They tricked us. Who had you? Who tricked you? We were in Miraflores. In the morning. Who tricked you? A sergeant put us in the car. What's the commander's name? Sanchez. Commander Sanchez. And Mayor. He tricked me. General Riva. He brought me here. Captain Riva. There was a gun. That gun, Mayor Sequeira gave it to me. He made me stay there. He told me, take this gun and stay there. I put the gun up. We escaped. Yes, we escaped. They had us with guns pointed inside the car. When the guns left, we escaped at that moment. How many guns were there? Oh, many.
So again, they were being forced against their will. Here's one video of them being held at gunpoint in these armed personnel vehicles. This is being posted by the pro-opposition Twitter pages and saying they were arresting pro-regime forces. So it's agreed upon by both parties. Now, let's see how this is being twisted. Now, first of all, I just wanted you to see the video of Juan Guaido here standing with these very confused looking soldiers, and there's Lopez in the back, somebody that was accused in the coup attempt in 2014 as well. And if you skip to the end here, you can definitely see the confusion on their faces, not knowing what's going down. And the soldiers quickly left that area once they figured out what was happening. They did not want to be a part of this Western instituted coup. Now, if we go to somewhere like Fox, we can quickly see how this is being spun. Guaido, democratically elected leader of Venezuela. First of all, Guaido was never democratically elected for any office. In fact, the only position that he ever held was from a tied vote, and that was not for president. In fact, Maduro won his vote with over 60%. I think it was closer to 63 to 67% of the votes, which there were international monitors there to make sure it was a legitimate election, and the opposition protested that election before it even went down because they said it was going to be rigged, even though there was international monitors. So Guaido has never been democratically elected for any position in Venezuela, so this is a complete lie, complete fabrication. So again, they're saying the democratically elected leader of Venezuela says, regional experts, you can't have a coup against a dictator. Again, Nicolas Maduro was elected democratically. He's not a dictator, just like any other government. So this is a coup. It is a coup, not a revolution, a coup, and a foreign-backed intervention coup with almost no support because they couldn't even muster 100 soldiers by tricking them. But let's listen to what they have to say.
Hi, good morning.
Yeah, I was listening on one of the other channels, and somebody described what's going on as a coup. This is not a coup, is it?
No, not at all. Juan Guaido is the democratically elected interim president of Venezuela. You can't have a coup against a dictator who stole an election, a dictator who represses his people.
Now, again, not a dictator, was democratically elected. Juan Guaido was not. And the very fact of the matter that they're trying to label this as not a coup is because a coup against a UN member state is illegal. It's very illegal, although that doesn't stop them from doing that in the past. They just want the public perception that their government's not carrying out an illegal action, but in reality, that's what we're doing. It's very clear, and even some of the mainstream media, they're still calling it a coup d'etat. So continuing on with what she had.
I mean, you saw the video yesterday of the tanks running over the unarmed protesters. I mean, this is not a coup whatsoever.
Right, so it's not.
So for her, she said tanks running over unarmed protesters is proof that it's not a coup, although that still doesn't prove anything, but it's proof that it's not a coup. So let's look at that video of the unarmed protesters being run over by tanks. Now, unlike the biased mainstream media, I'm going to show the whole video here so you can see what actually happened. So as you can tell by that video, they were definitely not unarmed protesters as they were chunking Molotov cocktails at these tanks. And as I said before, there were armed machine gunners intermingled into these protesting crowds. So calling them unarmed is just completely false. And I will go ahead and show you the proof that these were definitely not unarmed protesters. As we can see here, we can see machine gun nests that were set up along the road. There was 4 of these machine gun nests with thousands of rounds. Again, that is nowhere near unarmed protesters. And this is all pro-opposition media that I'm pulling this from. So it's not like I'm just showing the unbiased, untruthful events. I'm pulling it from your sources. So if we look here, we can definitely tell these were not unarmed and peaceful protesters firing machine guns into the air in the general direction of the government forces. as the government returned fire with tear gas and rubber bullets. Now, in Maduro's speech, he talks about how he wanted to prevent death and how they went about this, keeping their distance, making sure they didn't get too close. They didn't want to give the mainstream media deaths to continue to push their false agenda. So it was carried out very meticulously by the government to prevent actual loss of life. Considering the fact that they were being fired upon with automatic fire, with machine guns, with assault rifles, it is insane to consider that there was only a handful of injuries on both sides. I even made a tweet saying peaceful protesters using humanitarian aid to shoot Venezuelan police. And as we can see here, we get a better, clear view of these armed professionals using ARs and these MG-34 type machine guns against the government forces. They're waving their Venezuelan flags. And again, more clear pictures of these peaceful protesters.
Not a coup, but Guaido will be temporary, and we know he lost his Secret Service director, went to the Guaido side. But if the Russians are going to stay in this, Maduro's going to stay there, and there's a fear among people like Senator Tim Scott and others that this could turn out to be another serious situation where we tell Assad to go, and 4 years later he's still there.
And again, like in Syria, Assad is still there because he was a legitimate leader that the people actually voted in. Yes, he was voted in. He was not a dictator.
I think the Russians need to realize that it's no longer 2012 and President Obama is no longer in the White House. And if President Trump says that there's a red line that can't be crossed, I would imagine President Trump means it. I think this is why the Russians are guessing that there's still a weak-kneed president in the White House, and that's not the case at all. So I think that this is a moment for Moscow to reevaluate whether...
By the way, peaceful protesters, that same video is being showed in the background right after she talked about running over peaceful protesters.
Venezuela is truly worth escalating the crisis with the United States.
Yeah, well, we need fair elections.
So it's said by them that Russia's escalating the situation by standing up for their sovereign right of this nation ally that had absolutely nothing to do with propping it up in anything of the sort, including Cuba, which had nothing to do with propping up an illegitimate government. Again, if you don't know why Venezuela is in a critical, dire situation with food supplies, water, and other humanitarian type things, it's because of the sanctions that the United States and other governments have been putting on this said country. The same thing happened in Iraq, same thing in Syria, same thing in North Korea. You have people starving and suffering when there are sanctions being put on top of them. Although I don't think it is as bad as it's being portrayed, only showing extreme cases on the mainstream media, but it still is harming them, and this pressure is being put on the people to try to make the government crack down because the government is not a puppet of the United States and other foreign-backed powers. So that is the reality of the situation. Russia has nothing to do with that. Here we have another Republican talking on the situation. Let's see what they have to say or how they have.
Talked about the situation down there. I think the momentum is shifting towards a legitimate president of Venezuela, Guaido.
Momentum is shifting towards the legitimate President Guaido. Again, so we talked about Guaido. He's not legitimate at all. And momentum is not shifting because it was quelled in less than 24 hours.
We have the top 3 intelligence officials and the head of the Supreme Court basically take Lopez, who's the opposition leader, out of custody. So the idea that Maduro is going to a tarmac to fly out of Venezuela to Havana is extremely significant.
Is there a chance that that plane leaves today? Did Mike Pompeo answer that question?
I don't think so, because the Russians persuaded him to stay in Venezuela. We haven't seen the Russians in the Western Hemisphere this strongly since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So again, inferring that the Russians are interfering, the Russians had no interference in this case. Any reports of Russian military showing up in Venezuela is no different than they have been in the past 20-30 years, continuously giving military support and military training to Venezuela on routine courses with their ally, just like the United States does with their allies and other countries do with their allies routinely. It has no difference, no ramping up, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no World War III scenario that the United States tries to paint in everyone's head. It's not like that at all. And the fact they keep pointing out is trying to flee away from the country is the same thing they did with President Erdogan. And this is something that they always say. I even believe they said this with Assad, saying he's fleeing to Russia, he's fleeing to Iran several times. And this is to try to put in the mind of the people that their leader is leaving them, so they need to back the side of these opposition forces. That's the only reason they continue to push that narrative, and they do it every single time without
with military assets. They would love nothing more than to poke us in the eye. Excuse me, Bill, I have allergies today in D.C. But they would love nothing more than poke us in the eye and keep Maduro in power in Venezuela.
I think he's choking on bullshit, not allergies. Now we have U.S. admirals saying do the right thing and demands a sensible end to Maduro's brutal dictatorship. Now this whole brutal dictatorship thing, again, is out of whack. Again, we have Mike Pompeo saying U.S. military action in Venezuela is possible, meaning that their fake 100-man coup failed, so they'll do anything it takes to overthrow the legitimate government of Venezuela, headed up by Maduro. We even have Senator Rick Scott saying that Maduro is committing genocide on his people. He's referring to the starvation and the lack of resources type of thing, saying this is a genocide, which it is all being caused by sanctions from the U.S. because they're sanctioning their assets, sanctioning their largest assets, which is oil exports out of the country, because that's why Venezuela was so rich in the first place, because it's sitting on the largest natural proven reserves of oil in the world, and they're cutting them off from that resource. That's what their entire industry was built upon, the oil industry. And then they say, oh no, they're suffering because of Maduro is cracking down and keeping everything for himself, and it's all socialism's fault, which I have my own personal beefs with socialism alongside other types of government, but that is not the cause at all in this situation. It is all due to the sanctions from the United States on their exports and their industry. Now we have Breitbart saying Venezuela 1 dead, over 100 injured since military turned on Maduro. And the fact that they say military turned on Maduro, which is probably less than 20 or 30 tops that actually turned on Maduro, and I could almost certainly go out on a limb and say they were being paid by the United States government, because it's been proven that they were in the past coup d'etat attempts by the same U.S. officials that were doing this last time in 2001 and 2014. So to say they're doing the same thing again is not a far stretch. The fact that they're saying 1 dead on the most biased of sources Breitbart created in Israel and over 100 injured is a miracle in itself, that they can only claim 1 dead. When in Syria there was hundreds dead, and Maduro was able to prevent this death that happened in the past coup d'etat attempts that were led by the United States, Israel, and other countries, etc. And there was recently a video uploaded showing that airport and traffic was all normal. The so-called coup has been quelled. Venezuelans fleeing to Brazil surges during the attempt to oust Maduro. I'm sure a couple of the hundreds of people that protested and joined the side's internationally funded coup are heading to Brazil and heading to Colombia and these different embassies as well inside to try to gain protection, because they legitimately went against a sovereign nation. They fired upon them through Molotov cocktails and opened fire with guns on the government. That's kind of what you would expect, but I'm just pointing that out because they're trying to say that, oh, all the people are running away, but that's not true. Keep in mind that we had hundreds of thousands of people actually protesting in favor of the government today, especially with this being the government's National Workers' Day anyway. So if they say that, oh no, everyone's protesting against the government, no, you can look at the hundreds of thousands of people and you can look at the videos of this actually protesting in favor of the government, and they're not armed. They're doing it peacefully. They're not crazy, not throwing Molotov cocktails or chasing down and hunting these opposition members. No, this is just rational behavior. So I'm going to cut it there to keep this video as short as possible and make it to where I can get it out as fast as possible to everyone, so you guys can spread it so everyone can know the truth and the reality of the situation. I'm also going to be uploading an hour-long video by Maduro, his statements on the events later on, maybe tomorrow, so we can also share the truth of that as well. Now, if you appreciate the work that I do here and want to continue to see us grow, head on down to the Patreon in the links in the description below and send us a buck or two. Keep in mind that I'm a one-man show now and I can't fight on the same level as the mainstream media can, and the only way that I can even come close is by your support. You are the only one supporting me in the work that I do here. Continue to keep your eyes open, and as always, this has been Tyranny Unmasked.